We're going to get into a lot more detail. One thing for people on the phone, included in the package that was emailed to you are the slides that we're going through here. There's 3 different PowerPoint presentations. The one that we're working on now is called Navigating Uncharted Waters, Regulatory Challenges Created by the European Union, which is essentially going to go into a lot more detail of some of the highlights that Mike just covered, because not only does this impact the direct importation of foods into the EU, what happens with these products from a registration and authorization standpoint have the potential to impact tremendously the ability and marketplace concerns associated with where those products can continue to be used. As an indirect issue associated with the EU process is essentially my concern that when they started looking at the cutoff criteria, exclusionary criteria, there are a lot of things that are included in that list of active ingredients that are the foundational components of our IPM programs in the U.S., whether it's OPs, whether it's fungicides, whether it's certain herbicides. Once they institute those cutoff criteria and essentially they become non-usable in the EU, what does that mean for the continued registration and availability of those products on an international basis? We don't have a lot of answers for you. What we have are some issues around the complexity of what's going forward. Mike gave you a real quick overview of the differences in the system. You need to be aware and remember that in the U.S., we have a risk-based system, and the decision process is all contained within a single agency, the Office of Pesticide Programs at EPA. They take the data that's submitted, they look at it, they determine what the tox endpoints are that are going to be regulated against. They do a risk assessment process and then through a risk management process, establish how a product can be used and registered in the U.S. As part of that, they establish a tolerance, which is administered through FDA, but it's actually equivalent to what is an MRL in Europe, or a CXL, which is a Codex MRL, which is another thing we're going to be talking about shortly, which is critically important because the Codex MRLs are what are statutorily and treaty-driven designations of what governs global trade in pesticide or crops treated with pesticides. That's the final arbitrated number if you get in a WTO dispute or world trade dispute over whether a product is a technical trade barrier or whether it's creating an issue where things can't move in international trade. That Codex MRL or Codex XL, CXL is essentially the standard. Does that mean countries can't establish their own? No. They have a proprietary right and a sovereign right to do what's in their interest to protect their citizens based on what their law says they can do. In the U.S., especially on the tolerance setting provisions as a result of FQPA, which passed in 1996, we did a complete reassessment of tolerances for every active ingredient that was registered in the U.S. at that time. If you remember back to when that conversation started, because of the way they did the initial assessment and looked at tiers of what's there, if you plugged the MRL number in without the exposure component and looked at it across all uses, most of the acutely toxic compounds had a perception of exceeding the health and safety factors by margins of thousands of percents, especially the OPs and carbamates. Because we went through a very complicated exposure assessment process for dietary assessment and then also looking at the monitoring data that we have in the U.S. that shows that we have residues in most cases that are either non-detectable or extremely low, they plugged those numbers into the dietary assessment process to come up with a risk assessment that essentially showed that most products could continue to be registered and used because the exposure piece removed that perception of high risk at the consumer level. The other thing that we have in the U.S. that's different than the EU, as part of the pesticide law for a new product or label expansion, registrants have the ability to go in, petition the agency, pay a fee, and get a date certain of when a review is supposed to take place. One thing that you need to understand about that, when that submission is made, the very first thing EPA does is look at the data that's submitted and determines, number one, if it's complete, and number two, if it meets the standards of the agency from a quality control process before it gets entered into a PREA schedule. So essentially there's a completeness review of the information submitted at the time that fee is paid and accepted from the registrants to move forward. Does that mean they don't run into trouble sometimes with delays and PREA dates and other issues? If information comes up in the review that indicates there's an issue that needs to be resolved, they can put those dates on hold. They don't have a similar process in the EU. It's a totally different process. The other thing that's different in the US is we, with the exception of California, which is a third world country in and of itself and not part of this conversation because they have their own registration regulatory process similar to EPA. In most cases, the states have a very limited ability to modify or change decisions from the federal level. It's a federal determination that applies for the whole world in the process. The regulatory framework in the EU is different. It's governed by two major statutes, with one that was passed in 2009 along with the reauthorization of the Authorization of Plant Protection Product Standard, which has only peripherally become engaged or involved in some of the discussions to date, but it is going to have a significant impact going forward. 1107-2009 essentially is the process that's defined in the EU on how a product can be authorized for use within the European Union. How does it work? Essentially the same dossier of information that would be submitted to EPA is provided to the EU, but they go to what's called a rapporteur member state to do the initial decision process associated with that product. France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Spain, all of these countries have served as rapporteur member states to do the initial assessment associated with looking at the core data and determining if a product can be registered or authorized in the EU. It's strictly a hazard-based decision. It's based on the associated good agricultural practices associated with that label that would be the primary uses that would indicate the highest level of risk. So it's products or uses that have the shortest pre-harvest interval, the highest use rate, the maximum number of applications that are included in that review that goes forward to the rapporteur member states. Then it goes into an EU-wide discussion. It's provided to EFSA, which is the European Food Safety Authority, which is the group that's charged with doing the overall hazard assessment associated with the basic package on authorization. They do a risk assessment process, come back, that typically scheduled to take a year. Then they make a determination on whether it can be authorized. At that point, that decision by DG Sante or the rapporteur member states, through rapporteur member states, through DG Sante, through EFSA, goes to the European Council. If they agree or don't take exception, it moves forward. If they take exception, it goes back to the drawing board. There have been several cases where individual product authorizations have led to a request or a vote at the European Parliament. That's the issue that Mike was talking about, likening if we had, say we wanted to register Roundup in the US and all of a sudden they go through the whole decision process as EPA, the label's out there, it's ready to go, and they say, wait a minute, this has got to go before Congress and pass before it can be authorized for use. They have the option of doing that for every single active ingredient that goes through the process in the EU.
Dan,
Yes, sir.
I'm already confused. What is the difference between hazard-based and an MRL?
We're going to go into a lot of detail on that because how they establish through the hazard-based process without an exposure component, you get an indication of a much higher level of risk. And that's where MRLs in use in trade, and that's one of the big issues that some of the member states have raised in the EU, is there should be separate determinations on a hazard-based MRL versus how you determine the actual risk associated with use of the pesticide. That's where the dietary exposure, the percent crop treated, those issues come in and present a realistic level of the exposure side of the component. Nobody argues that we're not looking at a system in the purest form for an MRL that is a hazard-based system because it's based on a reference dose for either acute toxicity or chronic toxicity that sets a level that is determined to be that level that can't be exceeded. In the US, they look at a percentage of total consumption associated with that use, and if it's less than 1, it can usually be, or more than 1, because the margins of safety usually, they like to have 100. They've registered things at as low as 10. At 1, that comparison indicates that there's a potential for exposure with one consumption of one food item that would create potential risk. The difference in the EU system, and this is especially concerning for things like carcinogens and reproductive toxicants and mutagenic effects, which are usually threshold driven. The European system essentially says if you're exposed to one molecule of those types of compounds, you're at risk. And that's a health-based criteria that would prevent that product from being authorized in the EU. That's the biggest difference. You take the exposure component out of the management decision in the EU. And that's, MRLs technically essentially should be based on the same number, but it depends on where you set that initial cutoff criteria for the point that you're looking at. And that's why what they're doing and changing in the EU has such a potential impact. The establishment of MRLs, and this is where it gets crazy because the law governing authorization, this is the second round of that legislation in the EU. Second round passed in 2005, not 2009. The MRL legislation was passed to harmonize all the EU MRLs in 2005. And there's differences in what the criteria are in the two different laws on how you do the determination at the end of the day. Under their MRL law, it specifically says they need to look at it in the context of facilitation of trade, but the primary importance is protection of consumer safety. And that's where things get kind of mixed up in the process, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes on why, at the end of the day, they're kind of at cross purposes. And I'll tell you a direct quote from DG Sante in a few minutes when we get to that part of the presentation. We've been monitoring this through MCFA and indirectly FFVA because we don't do a lot of exporting to Europe. It's not a major market for our products. Most of our stuff goes into Canada. 80% of stuff we produce for export markets goes into Canada. We do send some stuff into the EU. There have been issues that come up in the EU, but typically it's been driven not by what happens at the European community level on our involvement as FFVA. It's been primarily what goes on in Canada and Mexico. We've been participating, and this is the third trip that we've made as MCFA to the European Union to specifically get educated on the process and moving forward in how to best deal with it. And that's why we spent a week in Europe back in the second week in October, the 15th through the 21st. Essentially, we had several meetings. The main purpose to go over there, the European Crop Protection Association had an MRL conference, similar to what the California Specialty Crops Council puts on in California every June or May or June, that focuses on primarily the Asian countries and others. They've indirectly dealt with the EU, but because most of the folks from California export into the Pacific Rim, it's not as critically important for the EU. We found out about this meeting, and it was jointly sponsored by Food and Drink Europe, which is the manufacturers of food products in the EU. It's the single largest employer and economic sector in the EU community by far. It's a huge, huge organization, and all of a sudden they have come to the realization that if this isn't fixed, they're not going to be able to maintain the supply chain of raw products that they have to maintain their economic well-being. So they partnered with European Crop Protection Association to sponsor the conference. While we were there, we went through a consulting relationship we have with Lois Rossi, who used to be head of registration division at EPA. She was detailed to the European Union back in the late 1990s as they were formulating their process. She worked at both EFSA and with DG Sante. So we set up side meetings while we were over there with both EFSA and DG Sante. We got kind of preempted in our personal meeting with DG Sante by the embassy wanting to have a meeting, and had been pressing for a meeting in conjunction with several other countries over the TBZ issue. So they folded our meeting with DG Sante into a meeting that was held at the embassy in Brussels. Then we met with one of the growers over there. They do have what's called the Food Chain Coalition, which is a special standing committee that works with the council in the EU looking at issues going forward. Luke Peters, who we've known for a long time, he's used to be in the flower business. Now he works for a big vegetable exporting production greenhouse operation in Brussels. He was heavily engaged in methyl bromide work. So we've known him for a long time. We met with him. He happens to be right now the head of the communications committee for that food chain coalition. And he also is a major representative in an organization called Copa Cogeca, which I'll describe in a few minutes. We spent an afternoon, Mike and I spent an afternoon with him going through the process and just talking about issues from the European grower perspective and what they saw as a mechanism to move forward. And what's interesting about that discussion was they don't see it being a government function. They don't see it being a registrant function. They're not sure how it's going to be fixed, and the only way they see it being fixed in the EU is for an absolute disaster to take place where all of a sudden they're out of food because they can't bring anything in. On the last day of the meeting, we met with Bayer Crop Science headquarters in Mannheim, which was a real interesting meeting in and of itself, and I'll go into some details on that. And that as an industry, and we met with some, or talked to some of the other registrants while we were over there. This is not unique to Bayer. The political situation over there is almost untenable. The Greens and the environmental community have so much power that they are scared to death to get out in front on these issues. In fact, their whole pushback to us was, we make it available, it's up to you guys as a grower community to be the education mechanism and the force for the industry to be sure that we can continue to use these tools. I don't necessarily think that's a good idea, but that's the way it went. Back to the Food and Drink Europe, and I've got a whole bunch of slides that I pulled out of those presentations. I'm going through them real quick just to give you a flavor of the discussions that took place at that meeting and the type of information that was presented. There were representatives from the regulated community. There's also representatives from the pesticide user community and food industry representatives. You also had DG Sante there. You had EFSA there. You had several of the rapporteur or the member states, individual countries' pesticide units there. Kosten Hargate did a presentation. He's with the Federal Republic of Germany. which has an interesting take as well on this process moving forward. I'm going to run through several quick slide sets just to give you a flavor of the discussion. Almut Bitterhoff is the Deputy Director of the Pesticides Group within DG Sante. She was the designated spear catcher at the meeting because everybody was there and not real happy with what she was going to present. She did a good job of laying out the process and explaining to the best of her ability why their hands were tied and why their process was going forward. Some of the key issues is the fact that they've got about 300 substances that they've got to review MRLs on. They've already finished 205 of those. A lot of those were done before the law changed on the implementation of the hazard criteria only. So there's a question on where they're going to do, how they're going to manage those MRLs for products that were previously done. And then they've got some others, products that are on hold for various reasons within the deal. Article 12 is the section within the MRL process on how to deal with these processes. So the important thing, they're not intending to go back and look at the old MRLs unless these two triggers are hit. Either a toxicological reference has changed, which means it's been put into a hazard classification by FAO or World Health Organization, or there's a change in residue definition. This is important because in the U.S., we look at metabolites in a residue expression, but if the risk of the parent compound is not exceeded, that product's not typically held up because of metabolite. What captured TBZ is the fact that there's a metabolite that's a reproductive toxicant, and because that metabolite was there, all of a sudden the whole product couldn't go through the screen. And to be able to challenge it, you would have had to have data that showed that you didn't have that metabolite in the specific commodities that you were looking at. One of the big issues that came up were grace periods, and that was coming from the food industry as well as from some of the production community. This is a term that we're going to talk a little about, the IST equation. That's essentially the mechanism that they use to determine the basic level to start the process for determining hazard. There's been an equation in place that's been utilized in Codex and in Europe and other countries for a long time that essentially takes a food item, looks at it, compares it to what's there to come up with that risk quotient that we were talking about, Jim, a few minutes ago, that says where the threshold is. What the European Union has proposed in the Codex system is to change how they use that equation. And essentially, right now they use the average residue from field trials associated with the product use as currently done. What they want to do is go in there and set that equation using the MRL level for the product to drive that equation. Essentially what it would do would be reduce the risk up significantly for products going through that process of determining what a safe MRL level would be. There's some work that's been done by a coalition of regulatory folks from BASF, Bayer, Syngenta. Cheryl Cleveland from BASF's done a couple of presentations. She's going to do a presentation next week, which goes in there and takes the actual data that shows the impact of the changes that would be, and essentially for products, it would increase the ratio by almost 7x on exposure, which would drive down the level that would be allowed. So essentially you would have a 7-fold less size risk cup around the specific active ingredient if they're successful. Again, this is a whole process that goes in because the European Union is part of the Codex Committee, and they are using that role right now because they are members both as a European Commission and as individual member states. So there's a block of 28 countries that essentially comes in at that time. When they come in and espouse a decision, they vote as individual companies, which counts more than just one vote for the European Commission. And they proposed the ISD change go into place. They're also looking at how the cutoff criteria associated with the process is going to impact how they do those calculations, and essentially what it would involve if they're successful in what they're proposing going forward, which has already been proposed twice at the meetings in Beijing and is coming up again in April, which is when they meet in, again, as a Codex committee, has the potential to throw the whole Codex process on its head as well. Hermine Reich, who is an Australian lady, is head of the pesticides unit within the European Food Safety Group. This is her presentation from the meeting, or extracted from her presentations. If anybody will see all the presentations, we have them and can send them to you, but it's about 35 megabytes, and it can't be emailed. It would have to be put on a flash drive and shipped. This gives you an idea of the complicated process that's associated. And when an MRL review takes place under the new system, which they just announced this summer, essentially at the point that a product's going to enter the reauthorization period, the registrant is notified the date that starts. And that's typically 3 years before the expiration of their authorization that currently exists out there. At that time, it's the registrant's responsibility to look at all of the information that they've submitted or collected associated with that active ingredient and determine if, in fact, the data that they're going to want for uses they want to keep going forward are covered in the gaps that they propose, so that they can be sure that the maximum level of residues would be captured. This is critically important for import tolerances, and especially for crops that aren't registered for those uses in the EU. You have the right as an exporter to petition the rapporteur member state to include in their review your particular use pattern, to be sure it's covered within what would be included in the package that would allow that import tolerance to be set. You have to notify them. There's a 6-week period, essentially, from the time they send that notice out that they're initiating the process, to get in touch with the registrant of that product, figure out what gaps they're going to submit or put together, and be sure that the rapporteur member state has the data necessary to do the review going forward. Because if you don't get that deadline, that's when you lose the opportunity to come back in at a later date. So you essentially have to anticipate your needs 3 years before the process ends in the EU. Previous to this meeting, there was essentially no transparency in the process. That's one of the reasons we had the meeting at the embassy over thiabendazole. That's a classic case of that process having not worked, because the registrant in the EU, because they don't grow mangoes in the EU, had never considered the use of TBZ as something that needed to be protected for an import tolerance. At the end of the day, when they got through their review, they said it can't be supported or authorized anymore. And there was essentially a 20-day period from the time they did that announcement till no more mangoes treated with TBZ that had residues could enter the EU. It was bad enough for some of the limited exports from Hawaii and other places from the U.S., but it essentially hammered Argentina and Brazil, who were the major supplier of those two commodities into the EU. They essentially lost access to that market because that decision was taken. The EU's attitude was, that's what our law says. The registrants had the opportunity to submit the information. It wasn't part of the package. We didn't have the data, so therefore we can't include it. We're willing to make a concession on this one. So if you develop the data, it's going to take 2 years to get it in, submitted, reviewed, and processed. We're willing to look at it, and possibly you can get back into the marketplace 2 years from now. The progress report is published quarterly now by the EU, and that's one of the things that Hermine told us about, and it's included in your package, the progress report that came out on the 17th of August for products that are still in the process, which sets the times and dates and identifies, most importantly, the rapporteur member state that has the lead on each of those reviews associated with those active ingredients. The problem is their active ingredient list is not the same as our active ingredient list. The other thing they're doing is they've set up an email notification system, and also included in your package is the one we received last week of their notice after the Standing Committee on Plant Protection Products meets to establish a start date for a review on an individual active ingredient basis. We're getting those directly from EFSA now. I mean, the two that we've gotten are products that aren't registered in the US, so we didn't look at them in any kind of detail, but essentially that would be the entry point for us to start these conversations. This is an example of what's there. As you see, this is a rapporteur member state, the UK, Sweden, DE is Germany. But one of the big issues there with the Brexit that's taken place, the EU had been one of the most active rapporteur member states for active ingredients registered in the EU, and there's some question of how that process is going to work, especially since it's products that have already been registered, gone through the processes with the UK. They're in the process right now of trying to figure out how they're going to reallocate those active ingredients to the member states that are still members of the EU. The other big issue that's out there that they really don't have a clue about how to do is things where there's a common metabolite or a common residue or a cumulative action group. In the US, we have to look at cumulative exposures for common modes of action. In the US, we took that down to the molecular level, and it had to be the same specific molecular pathway process for it to be included in a cumulative action group. What they're proposing to do in Europe is look at cumulative impacts on organ systems. So if it's a compound that impacts the liver, even if it's a totally different pathway or mechanism than another compound, they'll all be lumped together in their risk assessment process. They don't have a clue about how they're going to do that yet, but that's part of the requirements they have to do. The other issue, this is one that we're intimately familiar with. This is the mancozebs, the dibisdithiocarbamate fungicides. It's a baseline of most fungicide protectant programs in the US. This is the crop grouping that they have. To give you an idea about the timeline they're looking at, they've already reached decisions on some of the individual compounds, but when they look at the group together, they're not even going to start this until 2019 with some completion date off in the future. Do we want to get engaged on that? Do we want to understand what's there? Do we want to protect our uses in this process? I would think we probably do, but it's going to mean a lot of effort to get there. The other thing that Hermine talked about as part of when they implemented the regulations in 2008 on MRLs was they were required to start a process of ensuring that across the whole food system there was not a risk created in the EU. So they have a coordinated EU program on pesticide residues. Each member state also has its own pesticide surveillance process and programs associated with compliance surveillance, and they also participate in this overall process. That report, they just published the report on the 2015 year. There's extracted pages in your package of that. The critical piece on that is what's contained on pages 93 through 95, which is essentially EFSA's recommendation of what crops and what pesticides to include in the next round of coordinated program. This gives you an idea of, EFSA was looking at about, let me back up, looking at about 164 pesticides. If you look at the member states' list of pesticides across the board they were looking at over 774 different pesticides. The good news is the ratio of out of compliance and tolerances that would represent a risk are essentially the same as what we see in our PDP program in the US. It's very low. And in their case, it's essentially the same pattern that we have here. Most of the things that are showing up are things that either don't have a tolerance in the US because it's not registered for use in the US and it's coming in on imported products, or it's very rarely a situation where it's over tolerance for a registered use. Just the overall results. These are in your package. They make several recommendations, and this is going forward. One of the big issues that came out, and Coast and Hogart made this same point, is there's no standardization in the analytical methodology across the member states, even for the products that the EU have in their coordinated program. So it makes it difficult to compare the results at the end of the day because they might have different levels of quantification, different levels of detection. Our PDP program in the US, by contrast, has a standard process, has a standard set of analytical parameters that they use, and the numbers coming out of the 11 different labs that are doing that work are all comparable at the end of the day and can be pooled so you can get a real risk. One of the things that the law does tell them to do is they're supposed to do a dietary exposure assessment. They don't have a mechanism in the EU to do that at all, period. So that's one of the things that they are trying to come up with a mechanism to do it. This is just a list of the compounds and the pesticides that they've recommended. This is a list of crops that they especially recommended need to be included in the next national program because of MRL exceedances or considering the diversity of quantified pesticides. Tropical fruits, fresh herbs, spring onions, berries, chards, Chinese cabbage, celeries, kale, fennel, peas with pods, limes, lentils, celeriac, cherries, and grapefruit. If you're growing any of those commodities and have a potential for your product to go into Europe, you need to pay attention to the residue levels of those products or residue levels on products that might enter that marketplace. Yes, sir.
So, very little of Florida's products go to Europe. I'm assuming the reason our concern is about this is generally what happens in Europe, we follow suit. Whether it's food safety initiatives back 25 years ago, it started in Europe. Now we're doing everything that they used to. I mean, that's why we're wanting to engage in this?
That's part of the reason.
Yeah.
The other piece of the reason is just because we don't export there, and I think you'd be surprised at some of the stuff that's exported is finished product, whether it's packaged salads or some other things that may have your product in it. And at the end of the day, it's going to come back to you at the end of the day. And it's a situation where unless we know what that potential impact is and describe it, we don't know how to deal with it going forward. So that's something we're going to have to work on. And there is a significant amount of some of the herbs, watercress, some of the rockets, some of those things that are going primarily right now into the EU, into Great Britain, which as they leave the EU, that changes to some degree the pressure, but whether or not how that works, that's all up in the air. Carsten Hogarth, who is real interesting from a German perspective, he was very characteristically German. It was my way or the highway, this is what makes sense, so therefore we got to do it this way. He brought up the idea that there needs to be one MRL expression for risk assessment and another MRL expression to be used in enforcement of trade relationships and issues that are there going forward. Makes some sense. I don't think it's going to get any traction, but he pushed really hard on that to get it forward. He also pushed really hard on the fact that of the inconsistencies in the authorization statute versus the MRL statute, and which takes precedent in the legal system in the EU, because one of them was passed in 2005, the other one was passed in 2009. Is it the most recent legislation that passed, and that's also what's got DG Sante saying some of the things that they're saying. But essentially, he was making the case that this is much more complicated, and everybody acknowledges from all the data collected, the EU doesn't have an unhealthy food supply. They have a safe food supply, but do they have things that create issues because of their legislation, regulation? The answer is yes. How do you reconcile those? Luke Peters' presentation, like I said, COPA, Kajika. COPA is the European farmers. Kajika is the European cooperatives. This is at the EU level. In direct meetings individually with COPA, Kajika in the past, their pushback to us when we were pushing specific commodity issues was that's not their role and responsibility. There's overall policy development discussion. If we really want to engage at the specific commodity level, we needed to do that directly with the commodity growers of those commodities in the EU. And we need to go directly to each individual member state rather than doing it collectively at the EU, because if we can convince all the commodity producers of tomatoes in the EU, you've got 8 or 10 member states that then bring issues back to the table rather than just having a single NGO organization moving forward. This is a concept that they use in Europe, which essentially is they set their MRLs associated with a good agricultural practice at the lowest acceptable level that meets the agricultural need. So essentially they go in there and look at it and establish an efficacy level that they say is important, similar to what Canada does, and says, all right, that's where we're going to set our MRL level. And it's usually less than what the magnitude of the residue would be in our typical residue studies that we do over here, where it's maximum use rate, maximum number of applications, shortest pre-harvest interval, and then you put a safety factor on top of that to get there. What they're looking at is saying, all right, to control this pest, this is the level of residues that are there, so we're going to set our MRL at the level associated with that use. That would be essentially the same as if we go out there after 15 seasons of use of a product, monitor all the residues associated with use on that targeted pest, which our PDP data shows that you could probably set the MRLs at 10% of what the MRLs are set at now and still be safe and still not exceed an MRL, but your risk as a grower is much greater. This is statutorily coded in their law, so that's one thing they'd have to address an issue working for. They like the idea of harmonized EU standards. Prior to 2005, each individual member state has their own MRL standard. So,
using minimum standards for residues, has anybody done any resistance studies on insects or weeds on you're spraying the bare minimum out there, and would that affect this conversation any?
that's not been part of their decision process. They give lip service to resistance management in their discussion, but it's not part of their overall assessment or ability or changing a decision. That's because the whole process is decoupled between the EFSA risk assessment process, which is where that conversation would take place, from the authorization statute, which takes place in a totally different organization. And that's one of the big issues that we've got over there.
Okay.
some of the shortcomings that they've got that the industry, the grower industry looks at, and this is something that we've not really addressed here to a large degree. Everybody's aware that there are some pesticidal products that show up as naturally occurring products in the plants themselves as a response to disease organisms. So they've had a specific issue that showed up in mushrooms with nicotine, which was registered as a pesticide in the EU. It was deauthorized as a pesticide in the EU, but because they kept finding nicotine in mushrooms, they were saying that it was creating a risk and that food was adulterated and it couldn't be sold until they went back and did an analysis and started looking at both organically and non-organically produced mushrooms, and there's no rhyme or reason to the level of nicotines that naturally occur in the mushrooms as a natural plant product, which drives another question, especially on the cutoff criteria. If you start utilizing the cutoff criteria to allow registration of pesticide, what do you do with naturally occurring carcinogens, natural mutagens, natural reproductive toxicants, which occur commonly in a lot of normal food items that make up the basis of the U.S. diet? The other issue is they don't use the same cutoff exclusionary criteria for registration of other chemicals. If they did, there would no longer be any birth control agents registered in the EU. There would be essentially no topical fungicide creams registered in the EU. So it's a situation where they're applying different standards for different uses of compounds. Jumping down here, this is the one, Food and Drink Europe made the same points. Their biggest concern was channels of trade. What they've realized as they go in and implement with a cutoff authority and take MRLs, and there's been a change in patterns of what the EU is doing over time. Some of the initial packages that they submitted essentially indicated that the authorization ended in the EU. When that stopped, the member states had 60 days to essentially remove all uses in their individual member states, but the MRLs weren't impacted for a period of 18 months to allow the channels of trade to clear. Well, they finally realized that there are some products that are out there, especially in fresh, flash, frozen foodstuffs, that 18 months is nowhere near enough time to clear the channels of trade. Their pushback from DG Sante was, if it was legally applied at the time of the application, the food was stored, we won't bring an action. But the question then becomes, how do you prove that? It's kind of like at FQPA, they had the same kind of process established, but it was incumbent on the grower to do two things. Number one, establish his use was legal at the time he used it, and the fact that when he harvested that product, the residues didn't exceed an MRL, which nobody's screening their products routinely for pesticide levels. The big issue here, transition, like I said, national restrictions. There are some member states in Europe, even though they have this harmonized statutory standard, that are going off on their own route to do things. France is notorious for doing it. They've restricted an OP on cherries. They've restricted glyphosate independently of the rest of the world. They were initial guys that nailed the neonics outside of what the EU standard was. So there's still concern over application that's there. This is the biggest issue that they raised, was the crop cycle, shelf life of raw material. When the last application plant protection product was entered into the deal, so determine on whether it was produced using it or not, that's a key term legally in the EU. So it was a major process that they identified. Miss L's B-Dirt was real interesting because she represents the wholesale and retail distributors of commerce in the EU. That would be equivalent to the grocery manufacturers in the US or some of the other major manufacturing groups that are out there. her whole presentation was the fact that the consumer is always right. We're going to do whatever the consumer wants. Our basic premise is if we could have products in our stores that didn't have pesticides on them, that's the way we want it. We're going to keep pushing until we get there. This is where the third-party certification process comes in. This is where secondary standards come in. Most of those are driven by the purchasers on the other end. She specifically identified that the certification schemes associated with supply chain are going to get more complicated. They're looking at the third-party process to get information to the retail level or wholesale level that gives them protection. She was pointedly asked what their role in educating the consumer was in ensuring that they understood that their food was safe. And her comment back, that's not our job. That's DG Sante's job. That's the registrant's job. That's the grower's job. Our job is to respond to the demands of the consumer. The last presentation I want to talk about is the EU hazard and setting of import tolerances by Euros Jones. He's head of the European Crop Protection Association at least until January 1st, and he's changing and taking another job, so he won't be there anymore. He's a good guy, but he's leaving us. His biggest concern was the impact, like Mike described, of the cutoff criteria and its impact on import tolerances and the overall process of registration going forward. And this is where we got the first direct characterization of the differences in the two laws. Regulation 1107-2009, which is the authorization standard, is a hazard-based approach. The MRL is a risk-based standard because the WTO and its requirements for establishment of this says that MRLs have to be set on a risk-based process. That's part of the WTO. So if it's not WTO compliant, that puts them at risk from a WTO challenge on this going forward. There were two processes proposed. I'm going to get into this in some detail in the DG Sante presentation. One was pretty straightforward. Essentially, if there's already import tolerances issued, we'll look at those because they were granted based on a rigorous review. They're approved based on the individual country, exporting country's process, and in most cases has gone through a risk assessment process and indicates that that level is safe. The Commission's intent is to use the secondary approach, which essentially would mean if it's not approved under 1709-2009, which is a cutoff criteria, and where it's not approved due to those criteria, it would set the import tolerances, if it was granted, strictly at the level of detection or under the derogation process, which is available to EU member states associated with establishment of an MRL in Europe. That's lip service because that has to be a system of crop risk and exposure based on a European member state's need, not necessarily the exporting country. And for those that hit 32G, which is the cutoff criteria, it says they can't establish those import tolerances because that automatically qualifies as a health reason, which means they can't establish an import tolerance. These are some of the numbers. This was a study that was done specifically on endocrine disruption criteria that was done in February 2014, commissioned by CropLife International. Shows the impact of just the EU disruption chemical cutoff criteria potentially was 65 billion euros. Bryant Christie was commissioned as part of this presentation specifically to look at the overall, all of the cutoff criteria and look at what its impact was. That takes it up to $69 billion. The critical thing in their review, where they've compared MRLs, and especially MRLs that currently exist, if they go to the level of detection, the green colors are the commodities that are potentially impacted. Fruits and nuts, oil seeds and ground nuts, cocoa, tea, and spices, food ingredients, oils and fats, cocoa, vegetables, and cereals, with a little bit of sugar at the end as being the main ones that are going to be impacted by this process. That reads like a list of important crops in Florida to me, except for the nuts and some of the other things. But it's
Those numbers, US numbers, or?
This is just overall. This is a comparison of existing MRLs that will be impacted, associated with the cutoff criteria in Europe. This isn't just U.S. This is, no, everything going into the EU.
Yeah, I think that sugar would be a big component too.
Yeah. The conclusions that they made, and included in your package is the 2-page summary of these conclusions. This is just a bulleted outline of what was there. A lot of things we've talked about have been addressed. They do have some major issues that they want to work through that'll be part of the refit analysis going forward. One thing about the refit analysis, they drove home very hard at both the meeting in the embassy and at the meeting, the MRL conference. This is intended to be a retroactive look at how effective the existing law was in meeting its requirements at the time and what holes or gaps might be needed to move forward. Included in your package of documents is a survey vehicle that they just released the 11th of November for input into this process. One of the things that we're probably going to request or ask you guys to do potentially is do a specific response to that survey from Florida Fruit and Vegetable Association. The issue is it's due by December 31st. So we're probably going to want to constitute a small group to sit down, spend a half a day somewhere and go through that survey document. They claim it only take 30 minutes to do, but if my read through it is it's very biased in its construction because of the way the questions are asked. The place that's going to be most critical in that is filling in the boxes with text information that justifies what your position is or further description. And we like to develop a consensus process moving forward on that. The meeting with EFSA, we've already gone into some kind of detail on that. Her two biggest concerns in this process, and what's interesting is you get EFSA by themselves and you get DG Sante by themselves, and each of them are pointing a finger at the other group, and both of them are pointing out to the member states as being where most of the problems are. So there's no consistency or no ownership of how to best deal with the issue within their complex system. She was really concerned of what the Brexit impact's going to be because of the sheer number of reviews and processes that were driven by the UK. Meeting with DG Sante, in addition to us from the U.S. Embassy staff and the Monocrop Farmer Alliance, the Embassy of Brazil was represented, the Embassy of Canada, the Embassy of Argentina, and actually the Pulse guys from International Pulse Group was there. Cordial is probably being nice. It would probably be better characterized as somewhat adversarial because the initial presentation that was made by the attaché, agricultural attaché from the FAS office in Brussels, immediately Klaus Barrett jumped down her throat and said, "You've misrepresented what we're doing, it's not right, this is what the reality is." And then they proceed to go through a discussion of what's there. The bottom line at the end of the day, after all the meeting was, look, we're between a rock and a hard place for several reasons, but mainly politically driven. We can either be sued under WTO or we can be sued in the European Court by the Commission for not meeting our obligations depending on which way we go. So at the end of the day, no matter which way we go, we're going to get sued and it's going to be up to us to decide which place we'd rather take that legal battle going forward. Their whole presentation is included in your package. There's some critical pieces in this, and this is one that's in there. This is the production phase. This is the plant putting a product on the market. This modifies how member states are supposed to look at how they authorize in their member states. As part of the law that passed in 2009, it's a separate directive. It's not legislation, it's a directive. Every member state had to develop a document that described how they were going to manage the sustainable use of pesticides in their member states. Basic premise in most of them is reduce pesticide use. There's also provisions to do away with aerial application. There's provisions to go in and look at the least toxic compound being the compound of choice. There's a process within each of these documents on how they would manage resistance and some of the other issues that are there. But each individual member state has their own document. I pulled up 4 of them just to read through and see how different they are. They're night and day from each other. What the UK has is totally different than what Germany has. It's totally different than what Spain has. It's totally different than what France has. But that's what modifies the whole process. And then the regulation on MRLs is in their mind used to determine health and safety. On approvals, an approval in the EU is essentially on the same time track that a U.S. approval is, 15-year review period, unless certain criteria are met. They can be moved up into the schedule if it's in a candidate for substitution. If they've identified a lot of things, tox category 1 or 2 compounds, those are candidates for substitution because in their eye they represent more risk. Those are on a 7-year review. So you have to get moved up in this. They are attempting to group substances in a group, and I'm not sure what the AIR program is, but then in this whole reapproval process, this is the key part that I mentioned earlier. At the initiation of that process, it's up to the registrant to determine, number one, what uses they want to maintain and register going forward, and number two, what data is not out there currently that needs to be supplied, and make a commitment to supply that data in the 3-year period that this review is supposed to take place, because this is initiated 3 years before the expiration date of a product. Some of our problems on products that are important in the U.S. is the registrant in the U.S. is not the same registrant in the EU. There are a lot of products that are registered by DuPont in the EU that are registered by other companies in the US, and how we would establish those relationships or connections is going to be real interesting. Essentially, the applicant, that's the data. Then the risk assessment process, essentially the rapporteur member state does a draft assessment report based on that dossier. That goes to the European Food Safety Authority to look at the overall package to determine if in fact it meets the risk assessment and standards. They come up with a draft assessment. That goes back to out for peer review with the member states, and then they come to conclusion at the end. At the end of the risk state, that's where the Commission and the member states either approve or don't approve a product. And they can approve all uses or approve part of the uses or not approve anything or actually cancel all uses completely. This is the timelines. We've already talked in some detail about that. That's the application renewal process. These are the criteria that have been specifically identified as exclusionary criteria or cutoff criteria, and these are based not on the U.S. designations, which are slightly different. These are based on the World Health Organization's classifications associated with mutagenicity, carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicant, and endocrine disruptors. endocrine disruptor is a case in and of itself. There's some other criteria that were included in this: potential for groundwater contamination, which was environmental, and also persistent pesticides, which is an environmental issue. These were the ones that are included as health and safety criteria that automatically lead to a requirement that changes be made. The limited derogation that's there essentially says, if I have a use that is critically important to maintaining an individual member state ability to produce that crop, I can apply for an application. It's a time-limited application to maintain that MRL, to keep it in place as it's replaced or other products move forward. The other piece of that equation is not only do you have to have the serious danger to plant health, you also have to show that it has negligible human exposure. For an import tolerance, that doesn't work. You can't make that argument because that only applies to products authorized in the EU. If I've got a product that's critically important to growing a crop that we're exporting to the EU that's not grown in the EU, I can't get an import tolerance for that product if it's gone out because of exclusionary or cutoff criteria. When they establish MRLs, that goes back to the process. They don't look at every single use like we do in an aggregate cumulative exposure. They identify the uses across the label that represent the most significant or most potential for risk and make a determination if it can be safely registered for that use. And then the assumption is other uses won't trigger that risk. That's what's called good agricultural practices. For an import tolerance, and this is the one thing that we weren't aware of at all in this process until this trip, for import tolerances, if your gap is different than the regulatory gap that they use to establish the use in the EU, you can't get a tolerance. That has to be reviewed at the time this process takes place. That's what captured TBZ, that's what captured a bunch of other things. They align their MRLs to Codex standards because the WTO says you have to. One of the new issues that are coming up as they try to implement these cutoff criteria is that the decision-making process in China, at the very end of the game, they're putting reservations in based on what's proposed, and about 60% of the proposed MRLs or Codex MRLs that were proposed last year, the EU put reservations on at the end of the game after they'd gone all the way through the process and been recommended for approval by JMPR. That's going to continue to be a problem. Essentially, timeline that's there. This is when the review is going to take place. There's some question over if something gets captured in the MRL and the cutoff criteria, whether it starts a whole process or how it's going to be looked at. They don't really have a clue about how to do that. This is their first indication of how they think they want to do that. If it's a case where there's reference points value has been lowered, there's an indication of consumer risk, then it would automatically get an individual follow-up case-by-case review, or if there's a significant change of residue definition. And that's probably the primary driver as residue metabolites and residue definitions are changing to capture some of the metabolites that haven't been previously captured. Grace periods are a major argument. You can read these slides in your presentation. This is a thing that this is the A and B. This is the A process. This is the B process. This is their designation. They claim it's a work in progress. They thought they were well on the way to establishing this because this was geared primarily toward endocrine disruption until they were surprised midsummer over endocrine disruption. But essentially this is totally gone. Essentially it's saying you're going to have a new import tolerance request. That's when we got to the conversation that Mike alluded to where Carson said, yeah, you've got the privilege and right to do that, but we're not going to approve it if you submit it. So essentially, don't waste your time. Refit, we've already talked about in some kind of detail. Essentially, that's a stakeholder survey. We got to get that in by the end of December. Some information on contact information in there. If you think EPA's website's hard to navigate, go to Europe's pesticide website under Europa. It's next to impossible to find stuff. This is the issues on endocrine disruption. The U.S. went through the same process as FQPA. They instituted a high throughput screen with a whole series of tests that were required in the U.S. to determine whether a pesticide needed to be regulated for endocrine disruption. The EU was going through a process to develop the same thing. In July of this year, 21 of the 28 member states supported using the criteria that had been developed by DG Sante and EFSA. Represented 73% or 72, a little over 72% of total population in the EU. On September 25th of this year, the European Council decided not to oppose those criteria, which usually is tantamount to being approved. On 4th of October, the EU Parliament voted and said it wasn't stringent enough, go back to the drawing board. It's not acceptable for us to move forward. So right now, they don't know exactly what they're going to do or how they're going to do it. So essentially, that whole process is kind of off the table until we get there. Again, the meeting with Bayer Crop Science, just to bring this to a close, because it was the only registrant we directly met with over there. It was MCFA only. It was myself, Mike Arts, Gabrielle Ludwig, and Matt Lentz from Bryant Christie International. We had a great meeting, a lot of open, candid discussion. What surprised me in the group discussion, which they brought in their global regulatory group and their global trade management group, was essentially the philosophy or the process that they were looking at in trying to manage this process moving forward. They took essentially the same position that the European retail community did. It's not our problem, not our job. If you want to keep using these products, it's up to you as a grower community to actively engage and reach out to everybody else that grows those crops to be sure that you push back, because we're the bad chemical companies with a black hat on, which I agree that that's the perception that's out there. But at the end of the day, they hold all the data and all the scientific information that can be used to justify why a product is safe. So what's the regulatory consequences of what's going on in Europe? Very first thing is it's going to limit market. It's going to limit the tools that we can use to supply crops if we intend to export into that market. If you do intend to export into that market, it's going to raise the level of your management of those pesticides that you're using to understand where they stand in the European community, what the regulatory framework is there, and what your risk is if you allow product to go into the process. And probably the most important piece, and probably the most expensive piece of this, is screening products that you designate for shipment into the EU to be sure that when it gets there, it's going to arrive and allow to enter commerce, that you don't have a residue issue, which is not something we routinely do today. Indirect, it's going to impact the establishment of Codex MRLs, which impacts the overall, creates uncertainty in the global trade issue at the WTO. I'm concerned that as this moves forward and we lose products, there's not products coming down the pipeline that's going to replace them, and they're also going to be at the same risk level going through the process, so it's going to be an overall reduction in support, because just the dollar value to meet the needs into this individual market is going to be much more than what any individual registrant is going to be willing to absorb. It's going to significantly complicate the business relationships between the seller and the buyer of products as you try to manage your production to ensure that you can meet the standards going into those countries. Areas of potential intervention. We need to determine what our critical crop production needs are. We need to identify the specific maximum gap for each of those active ingredients associated with our use. If we intend to engage, we need to identify the EU registrant and the rapporteur member state for each active ingredient that we think is important. We need to determine as it goes forward if the gap that we need is supported by the EU data package or by the registrants. And probably the single biggest deal, because there's no clear-cut definition of where things are in this process, is trying to figure out exactly when to engage by knowing when a product's going into an authorization, initial authorization process, or is in reauthorization, or whether it's gone through reauthorization, it's hung up in the MRL. Problem we've got is if you wait to this point, you miss 90% of the opportunity to actually provide meaningful data into the process. This we're going to talk about in more detail after we get lunch and start the discussion on the other. At this point, I'd like to take any questions relative to this presentation. A lot of information out there in a really short time, very complex information. There's a whole universe of additional supporting documents beyond what's included with this package. If anybody's interested and wants to get in more detail on what's going on, I'll be happy to pull that together, and we can probably, because this presentation is going to be posted to the website, at least through where we are in this discussion session. The session after lunch is not going to be, because that's where we're going to be trying to determine exactly what role you guys want us to take as FFVA going forward in this process. So first of all, any questions now that I've...
So demand is X in the EU, right? X amount for demand. So if there's supply is cut down because you can't use all these different products, I mean, is there any discussion like that in these meetings? I mean, you know what I'm saying?
My personal opinion in this whole process is we need to let it run for about 2 years and have the absolute train wreck that's going to happen in the EU happen for them to realize. It's had limited applications where it's been seen to occur already. Glyphosate on pulses and soybeans created an issue about 2 years ago where they dropped the tolerance down to a level of detection. All of a sudden there was 4 shiploads of lentils headed to Europe that couldn't deboat when they got there. You've got the TBZ issue that's out there from a mango standpoint, because they don't grow any mangoes in the EU. If they're going to eat mangoes, they got to import them from somewhere. And the problem is the use that they're using a TBZ is a post-harvest use, and you're never going to get away from residues from that use. So until they establish a tolerance, they're not going to have mangoes unless somebody peels them, takes the flesh out, and sends them a finished product at the other end. Marzipan, which is an almond product, critical component of confectionery. They realized a year ago, because of an aflatoxin issue, that they very likely were going to not be able, because they have a fungicide they need to use to prevent aflatoxin at bud break on almonds, and there's residues, because the almond board screens their residues. They knew they had a problem. And they told the suppliers, look, if this goes through, we're not shipping any more marzipan. At that point, the confectionery industry went absolutely batshit crazy and got a tolerance done in about 6 weeks, where it should have taken 2.5 years. But we can't go through this process dealing with one crisis from another in this process. They're aware this potential is there, because if you look at the overall food consumption in the EU, they recognize that the majority of it's imported. They don't have the capability to produce it.
Yeah, that question has too much common sense built into it. They realize that their food supply is safe. They acknowledge it, but they just want to expand it and make it safer. And at the same time, they're imposing all these sort of things on us with the cutoff criteria and such, including carcinogenic type molecules. They're puffing cigarettes like crazy. It's very hypocritical how they don't want any carcinogens in their food, but 2 packs a day, no problem.
Some of the recommendations that came out from the grower community was to focus with key registrants, number one, because they don't appear to be able to do that as a group. And their hit list includes Syngenta and Bayer. They named those 2 companies as being non-responsive to the request from the growers over there, which is not the case in the U.S. on U.S. registrations. It's a totally different environment here. They also suggested that it's not only the member states that you need to work with, and Luke gave us a list of 5 specific member states that if we really wanted to engage and affect change within the political system, those are the ones we need to concentrate on. Some of them would be more fun than others, but that's an option we've got. He also brought up the fact, and this is something that I had not considered, kind of like Canada, where they've got a federal program, but then the individual provinces have the designated authority to manage and work with it. He threw out Brussels as an example, which is where he's located. There's 3 individual states that make up the country of Brussels, and each one of those states have their own regulatory program, and there's one that's pro-grower, and the other 2 are both urban areas that are pro-EU deal, and he would have a hard time, even though the province that, or the state that he's in Brussels, responds to agriculture's need because it's 2 states versus 1, would have a hard time getting any changes implemented at the state level for Brussels. And every other country, Germany's the same way, Austria's essentially the same way, with provinces or regions that are different. So that's another complication and factor, which that's one of the reasons they like the harmonized process at the EU level, because it sets a single standard on getting something authorized. They like the process on the MRL establishment because once it's established at the EU level, every other member state has to recognize it, with the possible exception of France with some of the stuff they've done. But it's, as a grower community, they like the overall concept of this centralized control and command structure that they're proposing. They just don't like the outcome of what's happening there. You had a question?
Yeah, it seems obvious they're just trying to shift the burden of proof and see who bites. European Union, they're just trying to, say, look, you gotta prove it, that's our standard. You've gotta prove that it's not there if you want in.
Which there's 30 countries that have already put the WTO group on notice that this represents a non-tariff trade barrier on movement of food products throughout the world. And the U.S. is included in that group, along with Australia and a whole bunch of other people. But that's one of the reasons why the meeting at the embassy was so critical, and the people that were there. If you look at exports into Europe, Brazil and Argentina are huge. And they've essentially been driven by the EU to partially adopt a hazard-only based system of pesticide registration, because they saw that as the only way they could maintain their marketplace. And now they're even saying, this is crazy, it doesn't work. So they can't meet it because and not grow a crop that can meet the needs.
And Paul, that goes to what you were talking about earlier too, and this is from the world's largest importer of agricultural commodities, and like the veg sector, a sector that's growing 25% a year for importation. So, yeah, they're shooting off their nose in spite of their face.
But having said that, there was a farmers union representative at the MRL conference that stood up at the very meeting, knowing that this was the case, says if our growers can't use a product, we don't want import tolerances allowed, and we don't want any standard that allows use in third countries for export into the EU that our growers don't have to meet, that they don't have access to. And I understand that position. I totally understand that position, but the grower community is not unified in their pushback on this either. Well, it gets a marketplace advantage of some type, but it's, everybody's cutting their nose off to spite their face. That's why I think they need to let it go to some kind of conclusion
Crisis.
and an absolute disaster over there. And it would hit probably the Norwegian countries faster than any other country over there. And they're the most adamant that the cutoff criteria is the right way to go. Because they can't grow anything over there unless they grow it in a greenhouse, or it's buckwheat or wheat, and you get really tired of eating that.
Is that the position now if their growers don't have access to it, they're not gonna sell?
That's the default position that the commission said. They said you can apply all you want to, but we're not going to grant it. And especially not if it was taken off because of the hazard-based criteria. And that's a concern for me because there's a lot of metabolites of some of the primary fungicides that we have that are B2 carcinogens in the U.S., but we make our risk assessment process of less than 1 in a million so it can continue to be registered in the U.S. The presence of a single molecule of that compound is enough to prevent that tolerance from being established in the EU.
So that would apply to bactericide use.
Oh, sure.
Bactericides aren't labeled over there anyway, and they're never going to label a bactericide over there.
And they're very arrogant in their attitude and approach to all this.
Even starting 5 minutes late, I finished exactly on time for my presentation, Mike, so that's amazing. Is lunch here?
Yeah,
Should be.
it's all set.
It's on the other side, and we're going to roll right into the discussion session after everybody grabs some lunch and comes back in.
And for those of you on the phone, don't hang up because we've still got some things we're going to want to be chatting with you about here, but we're just going to take 15 minutes to grab a bite and come back in the room. But there were some other people who chimed in.